You're listening to KZSC's Voces, Critícas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. I'm here with Dr. Linnea Beckett and Chris Lang. Dr. Beckett received her doctorate in education with a designated emphasis in feminist studies in 2016. Her research examines pedagogies of social change and learning in and out of school contexts. Her dissertation focused on a school and community change effort that created and used digital stories as learning tools for critical consciousness raising. She's currently working with 2 Latinx undergraduate students on a research project at a local elementary school community garden, which has as its long-term objective supporting stronger community school relationships and culturally relevant school garden teaching practices. She's currently the food justice coordinator for colleges 9 and 10 at UC Santa Cruz. Chris Lang is a graduate student in the UC Santa Cruz Environmental Studies Department who believes in the power of zero waste and plant-based lifestyles. Chris practices Nichiren Buddhism to tap into the universal life force that connects us all. As a researcher, he focuses on the relationships between consumer behavior and environmental injustice and hopes to connect communities in efforts to resist environmental extraction and toxicity and collectively manifest a just circular economy. I've invited them to talk with me about the upcoming conference on food justice. This conference is called Dig In, Cultivating Inclusive Approaches to Food Justice. The conference is free and open to the public. It is scheduled for Friday, March 2nd, 2018, starting at 9 a.m. at College's 9 and 10 multipurpose room, and it's for the entire day, so we hope you can join us on that day. Welcome, Linnea and Chris, to KZSC's Voces, Critícas.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Savannah. Great to be here.
Linnea, let's start with you. How did the idea for the conference come to be, and what are you hoping participants gain from attending this conference?
So the ideas for this conference have been fluttering around in different spaces for a while, and it was really from the direction of Provost Flora Liu in colleges 9 and 10 through receiving an HSI NEFA USDA grant that we started to really think about how we could bring a lot of diverse voices together to reimagine and make sense of what these ideas of food justice are. You know, there's a lot of activity on this campus. This campus is really seen as a hub for food, environmental justice. There's a lot of work that has been happening in the county for many, many years around really spearheading the organic movement and sustainability movement. And Flora, along with partnership with the Ethnic Resource Center and the People of Color Sustainability Collective and the Blum Center and the Everett Center, really felt like there was an important conversation that needed to be added to current conversations about food justice that really center issues of racial justice and also economic justice, and really thinking about the histories of the land and histories of labor, histories of settler colonialism, as they've really are so present in our current food landscapes here in Santa Cruz, in the county, and also in the nation at large.
I love that kind of framing. So for folks who don't know, UC Santa Cruz is an HSI institution, which means Hispanic Serving Institution, and this enables those of us at the university to apply to different kinds of grants. Linnea, could you tell us maybe a little bit in terms of a preview who is coming to this conference?
Conversations about how we were going to bring this conference together began about 5 or 6 months ago. We are partnering with El Pájaro CDC, which is a community development corporation. They have a kitchen incubator project where they work with local entrepreneurs, teaching business skills and supporting them to realize their businesses and really enrich the economy in Watsonville and Salinas. We're also working with Community Action Board, and we're really asking them to participate in the conversation as experts in the area. You know, Watsonville has a long, deep, rich history of labor practices with the UFW and the cannery workers' strike, and just a lot of stories and wisdom to impart. Maria Elena de la Garza, who just received the Tony Hill Award at the MLK Convocation, she will be beginning the day with us, along with Julissa Lopez, who is a UCSC undergraduate student and also a tribal member of the Amamutsin. After that, we'll have Lila June, who's a Dene scholar, poet, activist. She has been doing a lot of fabulous work around environmental justice and kind of questioning how we make sense of our landscapes. And I think that She's going to really set us off with some performative elements and bring us into the room in a good way. And then we'll have a Voices session in the beginning of the conference where we're really interested in having folks come into the room together. And instead of calling it a normal conference like workshop or panel, we're really trying to deconference the conference in a way. And the Voices session will be hopefully a little bit more informal, but really prioritizing specific voices. And the first Voices session will be on cultivating relationships and food identity, to think about the interconnections of food and identity and decolonization. And that will be with Julissa Lopez and Dr. Elizabeth Gonzalez and Dr. Enrique Salmon and our own Chris Lang. That conversation is really going to be about what are our relationships with food, and how do we identify? How is food really at this nexus of a medium for our way of being and our way of knowing? The second one will be creating agency and power in food, and this will be centering El Pájaro Community Development Corporation's Incubator Kitchen project. There'll be local entrepreneurs there that will be talking about empowering entrepreneurship, challenging cultural appropriation and commodification in food, and honoring homemade recipes. So they'll be really talking about the wisdom that they carry from their homemade recipes and how they've been able to leverage that into their own entrepreneurial work.
Now, Chris, let's talk a little bit more specifically. What does food justice mean to you? What is this particular gathering trying to disrupt in terms of the ways in which people have been on the margins of these really important conversations?
What does food justice mean to me? I think for me, it really means more of a connection to our food. People are becoming more disconnected to food just as a result of there's more automation going on. And the result of that is we don't know our landscape. We don't know the food that comes. We see it in the grocery store, but we don't necessarily know what was the work that was behind it. What sort of nutrients do these things have for us? We associate food explicitly with supermarkets and grocery stores, and not often think about sort of the seeds and the cultivation of food. And in all that process, a lot of times what gets left out is the social relationships that food brings us all together under. Instead, it becomes more of a transactional and a quantified relationship. Through this disconnection, we can't walk through a landscape and actually know which of these are herbs that we could have used. There's a statistic that I like to throw out. It's like there's 79,000 known edible plant species in the planet, and we only eat 7,000 of those. And then of those, how many do you think show up in the grocery store? Maybe 20? We're set up not really having all of these tools, not having these social connections to allow us to even unlearn and uncondition ourselves, and moving away from sort of this quantified relationship to one that's more social and spiritual with food, which includes a gratitude, includes sort of a feeling. Does this feel right? Do I feel good after eating this? Do I know the interconnectedness of the different labor abuses, the different sort of animal abuses, the different environmental abuses that have come from this? All of those disconnects are a result of our increased technological and equitable sort of foodscape.
Chris, could you talk a bit about the racism or the racial dynamics that you see present in the vegan movement?
A lot of times the precursor to like the vegan argument is linking sort of like animal engagement and incarceration to slavery and the slave trade. And I think it, for me personally, like I'm mixed race African American, also someone who deeply loves animals. It's been a complicated issue because I'm someone with my Buddhist practice. I see the interconnectedness of all things, but I can also see how when this conversation is led and sort of has been thwarted through a predominantly like white mainstream. I wouldn't necessarily like white people own veganism, but I would definitely say that through the mainstream lens, that's how it's been used. And I've met some amazing vegans of color, but it typically doesn't. A lot of times it leaves out sort of the social justice framework. Food is justice. How we get our food is entirely wrapped in our social positionality and our politic, right? And so I think without incorporating the environmental racism of pork hog farms and how communities of color are disproportionately impacted by manure lagoons that are sprayed and causing more MRSA and asthma risk in like children of color. I think these sorts of questions get overlooked when people just talk about they just try to promote veganism. And I think that's the sad part, is that because it's been mainstreamized and also not inclusive of a justice framework, that's part of the reason why I think it's not as successful as it could be. I think when people start to see all of these interlinks between social injustice and environmental injustice and our food and our microbiomes, and how we've been also sort of like programmed and conditioned through all of these different sort of orders and power structures that restrict us, I think that's when like you can blow the lid off of all of these and really start getting people to start thinking a little bit more critically and inclusively, and do so in a way that's like holistically just. For example, like people might incriminate like a Michael Vick for dogfighting. It made me mad too, but without also looking into sort of the social ramifications, the societal implications, and things that would cause dogfighting to even exist in the first place, right? In terms of how to make money. A lot of people have to resort to illicit means and means that might be exploitative, but it's like if the logic just ends on, like we have to protect these animals without also including like we have to overhaul all these other systems in place that are keeping communities of color down and low income people down, then I don't know, I'm not here for it. It needs to meet people where they're at.
So Linnea, let's go to you and talk a little bit about food insecurity, because this is now getting a lot more attention. It's obviously a subject that you guys will be talking about throughout the day. Why is it so essential that we think about this relationship between food justice and food insecurity?
As statistics that have been flowing around as of late is 42% of students here at UCSC are food insecure. The definition being without reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable and nutritious food. That should shock everybody, right? Especially at a campus like a University of California campus, where there are students here who are struggling with real economic questions regarding where and when they're going to get food that will not just fill them up, but keep them healthy, right? I think that is fundamental to how we are really trying to think about food and justice through food. I choose a rights-based approach to thinking about access to food because there are students that are having to deal with these challenging choices through no fault of their own, right? And these are socioeconomic issues. These are race-based issues. These are class-based issues. As there are many, many different reasons why these are questions. Why is the university composed in a way that would position students to make those types of choices? And so we're really interested for the conference in tackling this issue from at multiple levels. During one of the workshops, we will be looking at some of the data that's been coming in around food insecurity. IRAPS and the GFI, the Global Foods Initiative, have some really compelling data around what numbers around the landscape of what food insecurity and food access looks like across the UC system. And we'll be unpacking that during a workshop, but we'll be unpacking it with students who are working at the food pantry and food recovery program here at UC Santa Cruz, because we find that data and numbers doesn't necessarily always tell the whole story, and that it's really important for us to have conversations about context specific that are really relevant to UC Santa Cruz and to the students who are doing this type of work at the food pantry, and also for them to show there will be about 9 or 10 organizations that will be represented in that workshop that are doing this type of really important hands-on work. So for students who might be interested in being part of a food recovery team, to not only just have the Perks coffee, the little Perks coffee carts that food is now being recovered and redistributed, but what would it be like to have food recovery and redistribution through the dining halls? What other types of ways can we redirect some of the food systems here on campus to ameliorate that issue, and also to destigmatize that issue, right? Because it's not, how do we talk about it in ways, and how do we engage these in ways that recognize the systems as accountable for these issues?
Chris, I want to talk a little bit more about your research and some of the interests that you've developed in your short time that you've been here, thinking about the relationships between consumer behavior and environmental injustice.
So my undergraduate was focused really on earth systems, sort of an interdisciplinary program as well, but definitely did not incorporate nearly enough sociological studies. And my focus was predominantly on ocean systems. In my work after graduating, I had been blessed to get this opportunity to work in media around shark conservation in the Bahamas. For a year I was there, and there wasn't much like integrative community work taking place between the station that I worked at and like the local community members of Bimini. And there was some, but it wasn't sufficient to my perspective. But also Bimini as an island, which was 96% Black, was super import economy. So in that process, you see like a lot of plastics get kind of collected on this island, and there's a landfill, but without like the actual facility to handle all of these plastics, which aren't even produced there, but they're coming through sort of the neoliberal tourist economy, right? That just brings more and more stuff in a cruise line that was arriving. I was already seeing like this need for sort of environmental and social to be working hand in hand, because this was that was when I started really kind of seeing how this could be a justice issue, because the incinerator would get burnt, and so people on the South Island would have to deal with the repercussions of like smelling toxic fumes most of the time. Fortunately, not most of the population was on the North Island. But then afterwards, moving to New Orleans, and like my partners from the South, it really rounded out a lot of my perspective with environment and environmental justice, because a lot of things that you take for granted here might actually be produced in petrochemical factories that are so distant from you. You don't know the processes, but I've met community members who have lost entire family lineages due to just high rates of cancer, because there's a petrochemical processing plant that just happened to show up next door to their house 50 years ago, and now their family's value is worth way less than it was. And so it's a super just tragic relationship, and I think a lot of it is reproduced through our consumer complicity when we see how these products are made. And so for me, I see this relationship of how we can sort of cultivate like a divest or a boycott strategy in terms of products that are really rooted in environmental injustice, where you got like high levels of polyvinyl chlorine or something, benzene, and other really toxic chemicals that are exposing families to higher incidences of cancer.
And oftentimes families don't even realize the toxicity until maybe the next generation, or when they're older in life and getting cancer and what have you.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's another part of this entire food justice and sort of a justice framework, is like really trying to expand that information and get it to all of the nooks and crannies to bring out a collective awareness on these issues. If we're all interconnected, but certain people are being considered like a sacrifice zone, that's not just.
You're listening to Chris Lang, graduate student in the UC Santa Cruz Environmental Studies Department. His research focuses on the relationships between consumer behavior and environmental injustice. You're also listening to Dr. Linnea Beckett, Food Justice Coordinator for Colleges 9 and 10 here at UC Santa Cruz. Her research examines pedagogies of social change and learning in and out of school contexts. I just heard Luz Calvo and Catriona Ureda Esquivel speak on campus about their book called Decolonize Your Diet. And I clearly remember hearing about this book ages ago and realizing like, wow, how do I do this? How do I decolonize my diet? I wondered if we could talk a little bit about how you would describe this process.
Winona LaDuke came and spoke here. The way that she spoke of food and the way that she spoke of the harvest, and the way that she even began her conversation and speaking of the cycles of the moon from her tribal nation, was related to the seasons, was related to the harvest, was related to the cultivation of the rice. And that was it was part of her at a cellular level. It was part of her peoples. It was part of the histories. It's part of the stories. It's part of the community. It's so interwoven, and food itself is such a medium of life and of connecting ourselves to our home, connecting ourselves to land. And I think decolonizing your diet is a call for us to really think about these histories of colonization, whether it's extractive colonialism or settler colonialism, and consider the ruptures that have happened on psychological, on physical, on historical, on land, and relationships to land, and the reconfigurations that have happened since to create the type of food systems that now dominate.
And Chris, what about for you? You had mentioned earlier something too about how does food make us feel? And I thought that was really an important thing to be attuned to in terms of when we want to think about decolonizing our diet or rethinking our food decisions to center how do we feel? Sometimes we eat food that feels good in the moment or we think feels good, and then we feel awful 20 minutes later.
I think a lot of this roots back into the microbiome of just like there are like the bacteria in our gut. And a lot of this is dictated by the types of foods that we're eating. Like if we're eating like heavily processed, high sugar, meaty substances that like are causing inflammation in other parts of our body, we might end up feeling sluggish, or we might end up having other exterior skin rashes or irritations that show up that we don't necessarily know how to target. And then we go down the doctor medical route trying to find a topical solution to these things. So I think for me, the decolonizing your diet really tries to address like root problems. The stuff that people are eating doesn't have enough fiber in it. Animal meat doesn't have fiber in it. Fiber is what allows our microintestines to really, it cleanses us. In that way, we can really start to find a little bit more clarity of mind. Like in the African American community, there's higher rates of diabetes and up to 2 to 5 times more than their white counterparts, right? And so these things are related to the foods that we're eating, and the solution can come back to the foods that we choose to eat. And I think that's where it can really be an act of resistance.
I wonder if you have any final comments that have come up for you in our conversation that you would like to share.
As I said earlier, in thinking about unconferencing the conference, or what does it mean to turn this into a convening of people? And conferences are oftentimes one-off events, right? And a lot of our partners and a lot of the work that we have been doing has been really about building relationships around with these conversations at the core of those relationships, and continuing to develop those relationships and nurturing them over time, so that this isn't just a one-time event, but that this work of building these connections continues afterwards. So that's really the hope, and across campus as well as with community partners.
Great. Thank you. And what about you, Chris? Any final words?
Yeah, ditto. I love that, Linnea. I think food justice is a process, right? It's not an act. You said it very well. And we go on a continuum, we make mistakes, but if we can kind of always know and be humble enough to seek that guidance, to not always be the expert, and to be willing to make those mistakes, and also be willing to be sort of an impetus for our own self-transformation, I think we can really see some huge changes that happen gradually.
You start somewhere, and gradual is better than no change. So I love that kind of gentle approach. So thank you guys so much for coming on Voces Critícas today. It was wonderful having this conversation with you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvana. This is great.